Burkina Faso's Gold Revolution, forging Africa's next economic giant. There are moments in history when an entire nation suddenly realizes it has been living inside a matrix. Not a technological matrix like in the movies, but a psychological one. The belief that they cannot do anything on their own. The day Ibrahim Traoré stepped into the presidential palace, 20 million people in Burkina Faso woke up. And when a people awaken, nothing can stop them. In the heart of the Sahara Desert, a landlocked country is rewriting the rules of the global economy. They are not using blockchain technology or artificial intelligence. They are wielding something simpler, yet infinitely more powerful: the awareness of their own strength. Burkina Faso is proving that in an age of interdependence, economic independence is still possible, and perhaps the only thing that can truly save a nation. To understand why what's happening in Burkina Faso is so revolutionary, we must first understand the machine that has been running for decades to keep Africa in a state of dependency. This is not merely an economic system, but a complete architecture of control: psychological, economic, cultural, and intellectual. How do you convince a nation it cannot stand on its own? First, you create a narrative that it will always need help, that it cannot feed itself. That progress can only come from outside. For 60 years, Burkina Faso lived inside this narrative. It exported raw gold and raw cotton for cheap, then imported the processed products back at 10 times the price. This system was never just about money. It was about psychology. When a nation believes it can only ever be a supplier of raw materials, it stops investing in technical education. It stops investing in research and development. It stops believing in its own creativity. The world had taught Burkina Faso that its role was to extract and sell, not to craft and innovate. Brain drain became a natural consequence. The most talented young people wanted to leave the country to find opportunities abroad. Those who stayed were trapped in a dependency mindset, always waiting for help from outside instead of seeking solutions within. Government agencies were trained to please international donors rather than serve their own people. Institutional capture happened not through corruption, but through a restructuring of the entire system's mindset. Before Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso imported 60% of its food, even though 80% of its population worked in agriculture. It exported billions of dollars in raw gold, yet had no refinery. It had fertile land and abundant groundwater, but still relied on food aid. This was not a failure of resources or ability. This was a failure of consciousness. And yet, there are moments in history when all these layers of deception are stripped away, when a people see the truth about their own strength. For Burkina Faso, that moment came when young officers in the army began to ask, why are we fighting to defend a system that refuses to defend our own people? At the center of this awakening stood a man who had long understood that true strength never comes from outside. Ibrahim Traoré is not just a leader. He is a philosopher of action, an architect of consciousness, a catalyst of transformation. To understand him, we must understand the philosophy he represents. At 34, he is not only the youngest head of state in the world, but also a representative of a new generation of African leaders. Those who grew up in the age of the internet understand both traditional wisdom and modern technology, and, most importantly, are not burdened by the psychological scars of the colonial era. Traoré's core philosophy can be summed up in one sentence. Every nation already has within itself everything it needs to prosper. This is not a political slogan. It is a deep philosophy built on knowledge of history, psychology, and economics. He understands that poverty is not about a lack of resources. It's about a lack of belief in one's own capabilities. When he speaks of food sovereignty, he is not just talking about agriculture. He is talking about reclaiming the identity of a people who fed themselves for millennia. When he talks about processing local resources, he is not just talking about economic policy. He is talking about breaking the psychological chains of dependency. When he speaks of African unity, he is not merely discussing geopolitics. He is speaking of restoring the collective confidence of a continent. His methodology is built on 4 clear stages. The first is consciousness raising, changing the narrative about Burkina Faso's capabilities. Instead of saying, "We are poor and need help," he says, "We are rich but have yet to organize our resources properly." Instead of, "We depend on the world economy," he says, "The world economy depends on our raw materials." Language shapes reality, and he understands this deeply. The second stage is institutional transformation. He restructures government to serve the people, not donors. Ministries are refocused from aid coordination to production support. Budgets are reallocated from prestige projects to productive infrastructure. Decision-making is designed to prioritize long-term sustainability over short-term donor satisfaction. This may sound technical, but it is revolutionary. It means that, for the first time in decades, Burkina Faso's government serves the people of Burkina Faso. The third stage is economic revolution. The focus shifts entirely from consumption to production capabilities. Import substitution policies are implemented with realistic timelines. Local industries and value-added processing receive strong support. Financial systems are designed to serve local production rather than facilitate capital flight. Trade policies are created to protect emerging industries while still engaging with the global economy from a position of strength. The final stage is cultural renaissance. This involves reviving traditional knowledge systems, integrating local languages into official communication, holding cultural events that celebrate self-reliance and innovation, and promoting positive African narratives in the media. Economic independence cannot be sustained without a cultural foundation, but philosophy means nothing without action. And Traoré's actions have sparked a movement that is reshaping not just Burkina Faso, but potentially all of Africa. Revolutions are never about one man. They are about the moment when one person's consciousness becomes the consciousness of many. In Burkina Faso, this spread has been astonishingly fast. A psychological contagion took hold when people saw concrete evidence that an alternative approach was truly possible. At first, skepticism was natural. The people of Burkina Faso had heard too many promises from politicians. But Traoré did not just speak, he acted. In the first 6 months, local food production rose by 23%. Farmers began experimenting with traditional seeds their ancestors had used for centuries, abandoned only due to pressure to adopt modern varieties. Knowledge-sharing networks emerged organically as farmers realized that traditional techniques were often more resilient and cost-effective than imported methods. In education, the transformation was equally dramatic. Teachers began integrating local knowledge into the curriculum. Students developed pride in their culture and capabilities, rather than shame over so-called backwardness. Education priorities shifted toward practical skills for local production, cultural identity, and critical thinking about global systems. Brain drain began to slow as young people saw opportunities appearing at home. Most importantly, students began to see themselves as future creators of solutions rather than future emigrants. Economic transformation became the most visible change. Entrepreneurs started looking for local solutions instead of foreign partnerships. Investment shifted from joint ventures with foreign companies to building local capabilities. New business models emerged based on local value creation and community ownership. Economic nationalism developed, not as xenophobia, but as a strategy to build internal strength while maintaining open, equal partnerships with the world. Institutional transformation unfolded in parallel with grassroots change. Ministries refocused from managing aid to supporting production. Budgets shifted from importing foreign consultants to training local experts. Prestige projects to impress donors were replaced by practical infrastructure, such as irrigation systems, storage facilities, and processing plants. New metrics of success were established. Instead of measuring donor satisfaction or GDP growth based on foreign investment, the government began tracking self-reliance indicators, the percentage of local food production, local value addition, domestic job creation, and homegrown innovation. Decision-making was redesigned to prioritize the long-term sustainability of the nation's development path over short-term approval from international partners. Economic policy reform was comprehensive. Import substitution was approached systematically, not replacing everything at once, but building local capacity sector by sector. Support for local industries included financial assistance, technical training, market access, and protection from unfair foreign competition. Financial systems were restructured to serve domestic production rather than funnel profits overseas. True revolutions do not respect borders. Traoré's ideas and Burkina Faso's success began to resonate across Africa and beyond. Leaders in Mali, Niger, and Guinea studied the model. Youth movements across Africa adopted similar philosophies of self-reliance and dignity. Regional cooperation began to emerge based on mutual strength rather than mutual weakness. Global attention intensified. International development organizations were forced to reconsider their approaches. Academic institutions began studying the phenomenon seriously. Media coverage shifted from skepticism to curiosity to admiration. Countries in the global south took note of an alternative development path that did not require decades of dependency or structural adjustment. Perhaps most importantly, Traoré contributed to an intellectual revolution in development thinking, one based on endogenous capabilities rather than external intervention. He challenged neo-colonial assumptions about African potential and demonstrated an alternative path to modernization that preserved cultural integrity while achieving economic progress. Network effects began to accelerate. Regional cooperation initiatives based on mutual benefit replaced donor-driven coordination. Knowledge-sharing networks grew between African nations. Cultural exchanges celebrated African capabilities and innovations. Trade agreements were designed to benefit African countries rather than facilitate resource extraction by external powers. Youth movements, in particular, were inspired. Young people across Africa began organizing around principles of dignity, self-reliance, and Pan-African cooperation. Social media campaigns spread the message of African capability and potential. Cultural products, music, literature, art, increasingly celebrated African identity and achievement. Academic institutions began revising curricula to include African success stories and indigenous innovation, rather than focusing exclusively on failure and foreign aid. But a revolution is ultimately measured by the transformation it creates. Numbers and policies tell only part of the story. Real transformation happens at the level of individual human beings, in how they think about themselves, relate to the world, and envision the future. The dependency mindset was replaced by an agency mindset. Scarcity thinking gave way to abundance thinking. Individualism was balanced with collective responsibility. Farmers, teachers, and entrepreneurs began to see their work not just as personal survival, but as contributions to national dignity. As individual transformation scaled up, it created societal transformation, new production networks, stronger community structures, revitalized cultural identity, and a diversified, resilient economy. The national transformation was inevitable. Food security turned into food sovereignty. Youth migration slowed and began to reverse. Imports decreased while value-added exports grew, and Burkina Faso began to be seen internationally not as an aid recipient, but as a model for self-reliant development. And perhaps the most powerful lesson is this: if a small, landlocked, once-dependent country like Burkina Faso can achieve this transformation, then so can any nation, community, or individual willing to embrace a revolutionary mindset. The question now is, who will be next?